Welcome to my field of dreams. It reaches far and wide. To you it might seem nothing much, but I stand here with pride. If you build it, they will come.
Hi, I'm Nemo James, singer, songwriter and author, and I'd like to welcome you once again to my podcast, Nemo James Travel Diaries. This podcast is ad-free, but I hope you will forgive me for including short excerpts of some of my songs. If you would like to hear more of the songs I include, you will find a link to them in the show notes. If you enjoy this podcast, please click the subscribe button and share it with your friends. It will mean a lot to me. On this episode, we will be travelling to Sri Lanka, Sigiriya, Kandy and Ella. In Sigiriya, we turned off the main road and drove around 5 kilometres along a dirt track before reaching our hotel in the middle of nowhere. It was on the edge of a lake, and we had a lovely little balcony facing it. The hotel claimed that the famous Sigiriya rock could be seen from our balcony, which was probably true if I could have detached my head and put it on a selfie stick. Ablutions the next morning were fun, when after a 20-minute wait for the hot water to come through, the room became flooded due to bad drainage. It was a shame because the bathroom looked good. It was just that the plumbing was bad, which I suppose is not ideal in a bathroom. First stop was the Golden Rock Temple in Dambulla, where there were some famous caves. The approach to the temple was very impressive, with a huge golden Buddha. Up more steps were the caves. The first cave was quite small and very hot, with a giant Buddha lying down, but the next cave was much bigger and quite something with a lot of statues around the place. Most of the walls were covered with ornate original paintings. We had a guide, but he was stuck in fourth gear and rushed through the tour as quickly as possible so he could get to his next gig. We would have been much better off with an audio guide. The third cave was also big and impressive, but it had more Buddhas and more paintings, so the attraction was wearing thin. The most interesting thing the guide told us was that a few years earlier, a young German couple was visiting, and the girl sat on a Buddha to have a photo taken and accidentally broke 3 of its fingers. Considering you are not even supposed to turn your back on a Buddha, dismemberment is about as bad as it gets. The German couple were deported and banned from Sri Lanka for 15 years, and the guide was jailed for 3 years. The reason for the difference in penalties was that the Germans were tourists and didn't know any better, but the guide knew how serious it was and should have prevented it. In Thailand, when we entered a temple, we had to take our shoes off, but in Sri Lanka, we had to do it when entering the entire temple area. The trouble with that was that some parts of the site had smooth stone, which became very hot in the sun. Maybe that was where Sri Lankan firewalkers got their training. The soles of my feet were sensitive at the best of times, so I had to sprint across the stones on tiptoes. We planned to walk around the shops in Dambulla, but they were not very inviting, so after changing some money, we went back to the hotel. We had an excellent meal of swordfish and a dessert that sounded horrible but tasted lovely, curd and treacle. To me, that brings to mind workhouses and Oliver Twist. I am not a big drinker, but I enjoy a glass of wine or beer with my meal, which is why I found it irritating how restaurants kept finding excuses for not serving any. One place said it was because of Puja Day, a religious festival that lasted for 4 days. Somewhere else, it was because it was too near a temple. Our hotel was more honest and said it was simply because they couldn't afford a license. The government didn't want people to drink, so they made licenses prohibitively expensive for most modest enterprises. Having eaten far too much, we thought it would be nice to take a walk around the area surrounding the hotel, but when we mentioned it to the waiter, he laughed as if we were crazy. He said at night there was a danger of being attacked by wild elephants as they often roamed around that area. I thought he was joking, but it was such a big problem for farmers that some of them slept in trees and set off fireworks to scare them away. It sounded a bit drastic, but considering that one elephant can eat up to 400 kilos of food a day, it would get through a farmer's crops in no time. I was surprised to read that up to 500 people a year were killed by elephants. We spent a lot of time sitting on our balcony, which was magical. There were a lot of crows in Sri Lanka, which always seemed an aloof bird to me, but one landed on the balcony railing next to where I was sitting. At first it was on the other end of the balcony, but it slowly made its way towards me until it was only a few inches away. It was very nervous and flew off a couple of times when it heard even the slightest noise, but it soon came back. It kept looking at me, and I felt sure it was trying to communicate. The next day, we had a little walk by the hotel, which was pleasant but very hot. One thing I noticed and found amusing was that wherever there was a cow, there was always a small heron following. It looked like some kind of mating ritual, but even the most optimistic of herons must know that a romantic liaison with a cow would be highly unlikely. I discovered that it was because cows had some kind of bugs crawling around on them, which the herons were very partial to, so they jumped on and helped themselves whenever they felt a bit peckish. Everyone was so friendly. We were often stopped in the street and asked where we came from, and when we always said England, because Croatia just confused things, their eyes lit up. I had assumed they would hate the English colonialists, but that was not the case, and we were often told how good it was that the English built the railways and general infrastructure. Since the English left in 1948, there has not been a single metre of railway built. The trouble was that half the people who approached us were friendly, and the other half wanted to sell us something, so I became a bit suspicious of people's motives. We had lunch in Sigiriya town, which was tiny, and apart from an absurdly expensive gift shop, there was not much to do. It was our day for climbing the famous Sigiriya rock, which you are advised to do early in the morning to avoid the heat, but both of us hate getting up early, so we thought we would take a chance and go around 3:30 when the worst of the heat was over. When we reached the site and looked up at the rock, it was breathtaking. A massive lone rock stuck in the middle of nowhere. As we looked up at it, neither of us thought we could possibly make it to the top, but we would be happy to make it halfway. During the ascent, we had to climb a long staircase. At the top of the staircase was a cave with some wall paintings that were over 2,000 years old, and the entrance to the cave was on a sheer rock face, so how on earth they managed to paint there was astonishing. House painters in England were not allowed to go up a ladder without 6 people holding it, a hard hat, a high-visibility jacket, and a parachute. We stood on a nice, solid structure to look at the paintings, but even that was scary. We continued to climb until we reached a plateau close to the summit. There was a first aid station which caught my interest, and having once been addicted to the TV program Casualty, I thought I would go and check out what equipment they had. All I saw was a broom like the kind witches use to get around on. After a well-earned rest, we started to climb the metal staircase to the summit, at which point Federika got cold feet. I had a strange relationship with vertigo. I had no problem with those steps, or sitting on a ski lift in windy conditions hundreds of feet above the ground, but halfway up the Eiffel Tower, I couldn't get anywhere near the edge to look down. I was behind Federika, telling her to look straight ahead, and we got to the top with no problem, which we felt was quite an achievement. The top covered a large expanse and had flower gardens, swimming pools, and other various ruins. Going down was much easier, but by the time we reached the bottom, our legs were shaking like jelly. For our last day in Sigiriya, we had a dilemma. The official tourist thing to do was to go and visit an elephant park. Having spent a day at an elephant refuge in Thailand a couple of years earlier, neither of us had a big desire to go. On the other hand, there was a 5-star hotel in the area where we could have a nice lunch and sit by the pool. That's what we wanted to do, but we felt guilty about not being good tourists. Problem solving was one of my strengths, so I came up with the perfect solution. We would sit in the 5-star swimming pool and look at elephants on our mobile phones. Wanting to maintain a little of our tourist dignity, we would cycle to the hotel. We were dropped off in town, where they rented bikes. We agreed on a price with the shack owner, but I noticed all the bikes on offer were for women. The owner told me she did have a man's bike out back and went to get it. She returned with a large piece of rust with a wheel at each end. The good news was that the brakes were made of chrome, so they had escaped the rust, but the bad news was that there was no brake cable attached to them. I decided to take the woman's bike. I was surprised she didn't want a deposit, but then realised that the £3.50 hire charge would probably cover the replacement cost of both bikes, so there was no risk to her. On the way to the hotel, we stopped at an arts and crafts market. It was government-controlled, so the prices were fixed, which I much preferred. Federika found lots of things to buy, and for the first time in my life, I bought a painting. I rarely saw paintings that I liked, and when I did, it was usually hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds. So it was a pleasant surprise to find a painting of an old man making a mat from reeds, painted by an award-winning artist, for only £70. It would make the ideal cover for one of my CDs, and I already had the title in my head, Weave.
Weave a life of love, spread it everywhere. Stranger, friend and family, let them know you care. The greatest gift that you can give is that tapestry you weave. For your children and their children, and all that they believe. For your children and their children, and all that they believe.
It was batik, so the shop was able to take the frame off and roll it up so it would fit into my suitcase. The road leading to the hotel was very hilly, so it was a struggle cycling to the 5-star hotel, Elephant's Corridor. On arrival, we were more than ready for a nice curry, but were disappointed to be told that the hotel only served Western food because the majority of their customers were Chinese and they didn't like curry. When I told them we had come all that way just to eat curry, he managed to talk the chef into knocking one up for us. As always, the choice was chicken, fish or mutton, or occasionally mutton dressed up as lamb. It was a good curry, but a little hot for me. Federika likes them really hot, so I was trying to train myself to get through the pain barrier and improve my curry threshold. My plan was working as I got through that curry without crying once. After the meal, we were honoured to have the manager of the hotel come out for a chat. He was well educated, spoke perfect English, and was very interesting. He told us that when the British ruled Sri Lanka, everyone had to learn English at school, and everyone got on well together. When the British left, Sri Lankan governments insisted that English was no longer taught. It was an understandable reaction to being occupied for so long, but it turned out that speaking English was the one thing that had kept everyone together. When the common language was taken away, different sections of society were no longer able to communicate with each other, which caused separatism to develop and led to civil war. They went back to teaching English in schools, and everyone we spoke to said how happy they were that the war had finished and tourists were returning with much-needed foreign currency. The evidence of all this was apparent because, unlike most countries, it was the elderly and very young who spoke English well, while those in between spoke it badly, if at all. We were very impressed with the hotel and had considered staying there, but although we didn't mind splashing out a bit, their prices were well over the top. We were glad we didn't stay there, as descriptions of some of the facilities for which we would have paid so much extra were laughable. They advertised that every room had its own private plunge pool, but it was nothing more than a bath. They boasted a swimming pool, but that was 1 kilometre from the hotel, which was no problem for us because we had our trusty bikes. The pool was a lovely little oasis, with the most noticeable thing being a concrete lion standing by the edge. Every now and then, water came gushing out of the lion's mouth. As often happens when turning a tap on, there was a lot of spluttering until the water started to flow, so it looked like the lion was projectile-vomiting. After an excellent day sitting by the pool, we cycled back to town before making our way to the hotel. It might not have been our most adventurous activity so far, but it was certainly one of the most enjoyable. The hotel had arranged a taxi to take us on the 3-hour journey to Kandy. Our driver was terrible, but there was nothing we could do but leave it to fate. He kept overtaking blindly, and then when he realized he wouldn't make it, he would fall back into the space he had just left. There was a multitude of dead people who would tell you that sometimes that space closes up, so there is no way of retreating. At one point, he realized that we had gone past a place we wanted to visit, so he stopped and did a 3-point turn on the main road just in front of a bend. Had any vehicle been coming round the bend at the same time, you wouldn't be reading this. A friend of ours in Croatia was killed in exactly that way. The irony was that Federika wouldn't let me hire a car and drive, despite my 45-year unblemished driving record. She insisted we would be safer with a local driver who knew the roads. When we finally found the hotel, it was more of a homestay. They had described the accommodation as a 3-bedroom apartment, but left out the word shared, although it wasn't deliberate. They had filled out the Booking.com forms incorrectly, which I knew from experience was not easy. There was no way we were going to share an apartment with strangers, so we came to an agreement where we would pay for 2 of the 4 nights, and they would help us find another hotel. Most of Kandy was booked up, so we had to book an expensive hotel, but after such an awful journey and the unpleasant experience at the homestay, we felt we deserved some luxury. The expensive hotel turned out to be the most overpriced I had ever known, despite them giving us a free upgrade. It was just a bog-standard 3-star room at 5-star prices. Fortunately, we had only booked 3 nights, so we could go somewhere else for the last couple of days. We turned out the lights to go to sleep, and there must have been 100 dogs outside competing in some kind of canine song contest, but we were so tired that I can't say it kept us awake. At 4:45 a.m., I was woken by what sounded like a foghorn playing through a powerful PA system. I was dropping off back to sleep when there were 2 minor foghorns, and then at 5 a.m., the heavily amplified praying started and kept me awake for nearly an hour. Next morning we started at the Kandy market and then walked along in the rain to the Temple of the Tooth. It was quite a large area, controlled by guards, making sure people wore acceptable clothing. My knees were showing, which apparently was disrespectful, but luckily I had just bought a pair of linen trousers, so I did a quick change in the street outside, which wasn't easy to do while holding an umbrella. Near the entrance to the temple, while still in the open, we had to take our shoes off despite the fact that it was raining quite hard. It was a nice feeling walking barefoot in the rain, but it was a little slippery in places, and my feet got cold after a while. Inside the Temple of the Tooth, it was surprising that in such a major tourist attraction there was no information in English. The main exhibit was where the Buddha's tooth was kept. This was a massive thing for Buddhists, and it was said that whoever possessed the tooth was the ruler of the country. We stood alongside other tourists in front of an ornate structure and looked at each other, wondering if that was where the tooth was stored. It wasn't, and nobody seemed to know what was going on. We went upstairs, and although there was still no official sign, someone assured us that that was where the tooth was. We had to take their word for it because the actual tooth was not on show. All we could see were lots of people sitting around praying and offering flowers and incense. There were lots of smaller exhibits and a very interesting museum of Buddhism showing how Buddhism had spread throughout the world. The next day was pouring with rain, so we spent most of our time in the shops until 5 p.m, when we went to see a Sri Lankan dancing show. It was a large concert hall and quite tatty considering it was one of the country's main tourist attractions. We were lucky to have front row seats where we found a booklet explaining the meaning behind each dance. Years ago, we went to London to see a musical called Bombay Dreams, and I loved the Indian dancing, which was so exciting and rhythmic. I wasn't so keen on this classical style of dancing, which was subdued and mainly involved the women making elegant movements with their hands. Federica liked the dancing but said she was disappointed with the costumes, which I had hardly noticed. The men's dancing was more interesting but was mainly acrobatics, and although very good, I couldn't see what it had to do with dancing. The dancers were accompanied by several drummers who impressed me, especially when they took center stage and began soloing on the many different types of drums. To finish the show, there was a demonstration of firewalking, which was most impressive, although I do think they should have invited people from the audience to have a go. The next day, we were happy to leave the expensive hotel and check in at another for 2 nights. It was irritating that the new hotel was immeasurably better and yet cheaper and better located, as we could walk to town from there. It was a standard corporate hotel, which Federica was not so keen on, although she had to admit that it was well run, which was the reason I liked staying in those kinds of hotels. When we entered our room, I went to open the window when a monkey walked across our balcony, and I noticed a sign saying not to open it because the monkeys would get in.
My girlfriend's packed her bags and gone. She said she don't want to sleep on the floor. The fridge is empty, the cupboards are bare, so the cat's gonna live next door. Higher, the feds go higher. Down, 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 my spirits go. Round and round, the wheel keeps turning. Where it's gonna stop, no one knows.
The lake in Kandy had an interesting story. The last king of Sri Lanka, Vikrama Rajasinghe, lived in Kandy and was known to be a nasty piece of work as well as being wildly extravagant. There was a lot of unrest amongst his people, who were starving, and knowing he had to do something about it, he had a brainwave. He decided that what his people needed was not food or housing, but a giant ornamental lake. While he was pumping all the country's money into the lake, his people were fighting amongst themselves, which made it easy for the British to pop along and take over. They exiled the king and his family to India, and instead of investing in fancy ponds and lavish parties, the British built roads, railways, schools, tea plantations, and most important of all, cricket pitches. So there you have an interesting moral dilemma. Is it better for a country to be free but ruled by a nutjob who steals all the money, or by a foreign power that steals only half of the money and spends the other half investing in the country's future? On our last day, we hired a taxi to take us to the botanical garden. They gave us a free map that turned out to bear no relationship to the place we were visiting, which covered a large area with lots of paths. In one place, the map said you could be here. At another location, it said, or you might be here. Over to the west, it said, this is not the orchid house. Okay, it didn't say exactly that, but it wasn't far off. It was still very enjoyable, and we managed to see most of it before the rain started. Next was a tea factory. We were greeted at the door by a very friendly woman who gave us a tour. As soon as we entered the factory, there was a wonderfully overpowering smell of tea, which was kept in the dozens of open boxes around the storeroom. She went through each stage of producing tea, and I was surprised that the same tea leaves produced so many different blends of tea depending on how they were processed. They started by putting leaves from the tea plant into a machine to crush them, and what was produced in the first run produced the best tea. What remained was put through the machine again and again, and each time the quality of the tea was reduced. In the end, they were left with a lot of dust on the floor, which they swept up and sold to supermarkets. I liked Earl Grey tea, and silly me, I thought there was a special Earl Grey plant, but I discovered that the taste came from the oil of bergamot that they added to it. Many of the other fancy teas were produced by either adding ingredients or doing things to the leaves before going through the grinder. At the end of the tour, there was a shop where they gave us a free cup of tea, but they refused to give us milk with it, so it was so strong that I found it unpalatable. There was a large selection of very expensive tea on sale with fancy packaging, and we bought a few small packets for presents. Finally, our driver suggested we visit a jewellery factory. A man met us at the door with the sign, "Our prices are exorbitant," practically tattooed on his forehead. He took us to a room and showed us an interesting video on how gemstones were mined. The sign on the man's forehead changed to "Get your credit card out," and he showed us his workers making the jewellery. He sat us down and produced a tray of gems, asking which ones we wanted. Federika showed some interest in a pair of earrings, and after avoiding the price for as long as possible, he quoted £140. Federika got quite angry with him, which was unusual for her, so he immediately dropped the price to £80, which was still around double what it would cost in England. I was feeling awkward as he had spent an hour working on us, so I felt an obligation to buy something, but Federika stayed strong and told him politely where to stick his gems. That evening we did a lot of shopping, and it was ironic that, having done so much walking and climbing steps, Federika injured her leg quite badly while trying on a pair of trousers. She had no idea how it happened, and the first she knew of it was when we were walking out of the shop and there was a sharp pain near her hip. She must have pulled a muscle, but fortunately we had finished shopping by then, and there was no more walking for the rest of that day. Our next stop was Ella. One of the main tourist attractions in Sri Lanka was the Kandy to Ella train journey. After the uncomfortable Colombo to Anuradhapura train journey, I wasn't looking forward to it, but on arrival at Kandy station, I was pleasantly surprised at how much better it was than Colombo. The train arrived an hour late, and we made our way along the platform looking for our seats. The first few carriages were third class and looked horrendous. For young backpackers, it would have been all part of the fun, but some of the older people who were determined to travel like the locals had expressions on their faces like Satan had just led them to their final resting place. People were crushed together like sardines in the intense heat, knowing they were there for 6 hours. Tickets in the better carriages had to be booked well in advance, which fortunately we had done through an agency before we left the UK. Our second-class carriage was at the front of the train, and we were relieved to find our seats were not only empty but comfortable. We even had a little table in front of us. Unlike the Colombo train, nothing was obscuring our view out of the window, and this time we were facing the direction of travel. The scenery was extraordinary, with oceans of tea plantations filling every inch of land.
Wheels go round, the engine turns, miles pass slowly, the fuel gets burned. Wheels go round, the engine turns. Wheels go round, time passes by. Some say hello, and some say goodbye. Some say hello, some say goodbye.
I was mesmerized by the armies of workers hunched over tea plants, slowly filling the baskets on their backs. To my surprise, Federika told me that tea had been introduced to Sri Lanka by a Scotsman, and what an extraordinary legacy he left. During the journey, countless children were walking alongside the railway tracks, returning from school in pristine uniforms. We stopped at one station and saw a young boy walking by himself in a strange manner. When he got close, we realized the sole of his shoe had become detached and was only held on at the heel, so his shoe flapped as he walked. The only way he could stop from tripping himself up was by raising his foot vertically before stepping forward, which looked so comical, but he seemed happy enough. At most stations, children stood in front of the windows with their hands out. They weren't asking for food or money, but pens. Federika managed to find a couple in her handbag and drop them through the small gap at the top of the window. Education was free in Sri Lanka, and children were even given school uniforms, which were compulsory, but schools weren't given any funding for supplies, so parents had to provide books and stationery from their meagre income. Some parents simply didn't have the money, so sadly, their children had to stay at home as they were not allowed into school without shoes or books. At Ella, nearly everyone got off, which wasn't easy because the train was a metre higher than the platform. It was comical watching people hanging off the train as if they were trying to get down from a high wall. There was no warning, so there must have been occasions when people stepped off the train without looking down and hurt themselves. A tuk-tuk was waiting to collect us from the station, and we struggled in the rain to load our suitcases onto the tiny space at the back. They were shamefully heavy and more suitable for juggernauts than tuk-tuks. It was a short drive to our hotel, and what a relief it was to get into our room after all those hours of being thrown around on the train. The room was large and eccentric. Very high ceilings allowed for huge windows that gave a magnificent view of the mountain range from anywhere in our room, even lying on our bed. It was a new building, and being made entirely of wood, still had that lovely freshly cut wood smell. There was a balcony with 2 lounge chairs where we could sit and look at the mountain. From there, it started to get weird. There was a very narrow bathroom that stretched the entire length of the room. A basin at one end, a toilet in the middle looking very lonely, and a shower at the far end, right in front of a huge window. Whether anyone could see us showering through that window was questionable, but certainly anyone climbing in the tree opposite would have had no problem. In between the bedroom and the bathroom was a large window, and although it was frosted glass, you could still see what someone was up to in the bathroom. It also meant that if the bathroom light was turned on in the middle of the night, the whole bedroom was flooded with light. There were no hand or towel rails of any kind, no wardrobe, just a weird wooden structure where we could lay our clothes. It was a king-sized bed, but 2 single blankets had to be strategically placed in order to cover the bed. The bath towels were really worn out and had stains on them. I looked out our window and saw an infestation of what looked like large flying ants, but the owner said they were termites. We asked for another blanket, and when he returned a few minutes later and opened the door, our room filled with termites, which took half an hour to get rid of. The extra blanket he gave us was half the size of the bed and was obviously a child's blanket, so we were concerned that one of their children would go cold that night because of us. Despite the eccentricities and it being quite overpriced, we loved the room. When I booked it, I paid $15 extra for a welcome meal, but the owner said they were bed and breakfast only and didn't serve food at any other time. When I asked him why he charged me for dinner, then his English suddenly deteriorated, so that was the last I saw of that $15. It was still raining, so we took a tuk-tuk to town, and after a very filling roti, we returned to our room exhausted. Next morning we woke up to the sound of pouring rain. The weather forecast said 100% rain all day, and it would stay like that for the next few days, so things weren't looking good for our stay in Ella. After breakfast, the rain seemed to stop, so although it still looked bleak, we took our inadequate fold-up umbrellas and set out for our morning trek. Adams Peak was the main tourist destination for the area, where at the summit there was an impression of a footprint that was originally claimed to be the Buddha's footprint, but was then later claimed by other religions. At over 2,000 meters, it was far too much for me to handle, so we went to the less demanding Little Adams Peak. Along the way, we watched women working in the tea plantations. It must have been back-breaking work, but they all waved and gave us a friendly smile. We passed 2 old women struggling with piles of firewood who offered to let us take a photo with them in return for a few rupees, and who could refuse an offer like that? I did wonder if they used the firewood or if it was just a stage prop. We made it most of the way, but there were still a lot of steps to the summit, and Federika was finding it difficult with her injured leg. It was just as well because up till then the rain had held off, but the minute we got to the bottom and sat down to lunch, it started to pour down. It only seemed to rain for short periods and was not that heavy, so our umbrellas were adequate, but the trouble was the constant temperature change. When the clouds were thick and the rain was drizzling, I was happy to have my thick jeans and trainers on, but when the sun came out, I was so hot I had to take my shirt off and walk bare-chested, which must have made it difficult for the female tea pickers to concentrate on their work. Next morning, the weather was bad again, but during a lull in the rain, we set out for the other main attraction, Ella Rock. There seemed to be a lot of confusion about how to climb this rock. Some people said we shouldn't go on the walk without a guide because there were lots of wrong paths that could be taken. Others said that was a story put around by guides. A few years earlier, they put up signposts showing the route, but they mysteriously disappeared. Even where to start the walk was controversial, so we followed the advice in the Lonely Planet and hired a tuk-tuk to drive us 6 kilometers to a disused railway station. From there, we followed an old railway track, which was brilliant as it made me feel like one of those ancient explorers looking for the source of the Nile. In front of us were a couple of young Swedish boys who seemed to know where they were going, so when they turned off the path, we followed them blindly. We walked around a farm and started to ascend a steep path when a local told us we were not allowed to walk up there because it was private land, and that we should walk down another path he was pointing at. Thinking it was just another scam, we all ignored him, but it got so steep and difficult to climb that we had to turn back, and so the old man was right. When he saw us retreating, he gave us the internationally understood, stupid, bloody foreigners look. We found the right path and walked as far as we could before it got too steep for us to continue with Federika's bad leg. Going up wouldn't have been such a problem as getting back down. The path back to town was pretty obvious, as there was a steady stream of tourists doing the same thing, so it was nonsense to suggest a guide was essential. We were going to take a tuk-tuk back, but when we got to the station, someone told us that if we continued to follow the tracks, it was only 3 kilometers to town, so although we were already pretty tired, we decided to walk. We had only walked a few steps when the same man shouted at us, "Train coming! Train coming!" The tracks looked so old and unmaintained that it never occurred to us that they were in use. We got off the tracks and stood by the side, but a few meters behind us there was a lone walker with headphones on. We all shouted at him to get off the tracks, but he couldn't hear us because of the headphones. I expect it was the vibration that made him turn around and get to safety, but it could have been very nasty. We really enjoyed the walk through the middle of a valley with spectacular scenery on either side. It was surprising how many other people were doing the same walk, most of them being locals, including a lot of school children. Nearly all of them smiled and said hello in a way that said we were welcome in their country. By the time we got to town, I don't remember my legs ever being so tired. We headed straight to a restaurant for lunch, and the minute we sat down, the heavens opened with monsoon-like rain. Again, if it hadn't been for Federika's bad leg, we would probably have been somewhere near the top of the Ella Rock when the rain came. On our final day, with a lack of much to do, we booked a taxi to take us to another tea factory and then back to town, where Federika went for an Ayurveda massage while I sat in a cafe and did some writing. That evening, we went to a Sri Lankan curry cooking course that was recommended on TripAdvisor. I was a bit concerned when we arrived at the property, as it looked too basic to even make a cup of tea, but the first thing he did was show us a book with very impressive reviews of his previous clients. I wondered if I should warn him about my history of kitchen nightmares and check that he had adequate fire insurance, but as the only English he knew was 2,000 rupees, there was no point. Memories came flooding back of my attempt at warming up a muffin in a Los Angeles apartment when it caught fire and I set the building's fire alarm off. We were the only people on the course. He led us to a small, open mud hut where the walls were 1 meter high and the non-existent windows reached the ceiling, which was supported by more mud. The floor was also made of mud. There was an open fire burning with 2 hobs, all made out of clay. I estimated that they were violating approximately 1.6 million EEC regulations on commercial food preparation, but as we would only be cooking vegetables, none of them were important, and in fairness, there were still 500,000 regulations that they complied with. We had done a cooking class in Vietnam, where we all had our own cookers and aprons, and did the cooking ourselves while we followed the instructor, who had an overhead projector. You will probably not be surprised to hear there was no overhead projector or even electricity in the hut. It soon became apparent that the instructor would be doing most of the cooking while we watched and learnt. We were relegated to stirring the odd thingy and cutting the odd what's-it, and it must be said that I removed the skin from the hot potatoes with great skill. As always, some of the potatoes jumped out of my hand, but I picked them up from the floor well within the 3-second rule. He threw in dozens of spices and odds and ends, including a curry leaf. Although our instructor didn't speak a word of English, I had to admire his mastery of positive response. Are we going to get a book with these recipes?
Yes.
What vegetable is that?
Yes.
How many side dishes will we be making?
Yes.
Do you think England has a better cricket team than Sri Lanka?
Yes.
No matter what the question was, the answer was always yes, and we never did get our book of recipes despite it being part of the deal. We finished the cooking, and as claimed in the sales literature, we ended up with 6 different curries, although I had my doubts that a poppadom was a curry. Federika was a little disappointed that there was nothing interesting in the main ingredients. It was cabbage, onions, potatoes, dozens of spices and lots of what we in the trade call other stuff. It looked and sounded boring, but I had to admit it tasted amazing. It was the perfect vegetarian curry, and the only thing that might have improved it was a little sprinkle of lamb. Thank you for listening to Nemo James Travel Diaries. Photos and videos of my adventures, together with my music and the books I have published, can be found on my website www.nemojames.com/travels. You will also find details of my mobile phone app, Wordbanker, which is designed to help you build a foreign language vocabulary. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please click the subscribe button and share it with your friends. It will mean a lot to me. In the next episode, we will be traveling to Sri Lanka, Matara, Dangale, Gale and Colombo.
Do you like the songs I've sung to you? Do you like the time that we've been through? Do you like my music? Do you like to sing along? Yes, we like the songs that you have sung. We like the friends that we've become. We like your music. We like your music. We like your music and the words of your song.